Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We're just going to wait until more and more people start entering the call. Welcome, everyone. To those of you who just joined, we're just going to give it another minute or two as more and more people start to join the call. All right, everyone, welcome to our post-election analysis today, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, whichever time zone you are in. My name is Abby Kirschbaum, and I am the Assistant Director of Public Engagement and Educational Resources at J Street. Today, we are going to be talking about the fourth election in Israel in the last 2 years. We are all, as you can imagine, watching history unfold before our very eyes, or screens rather. And so today we are joined by our very special guest, Israel-based journalist Neri Zilber, whose bio I will provide for you in just a minute. We're going to be talking about the kind of general state of play in the Israeli political sphere, what's going on the day after the elections, who are the winners and the losers, what can we expect, when can we expect a majority to be clear to us in the immediate near future. And we are going to have Neri Zilber dive into that for us. So I'm going to just introduce our speaker today, but actually really quickly before I do, one final thing. I know our audience today has probably been on a number of webinars as of late, but I just want to direct you all to the bottom of your screen where you can see the question and answer feature, the Q&A feature, where you can just ask whatever type of questions you would like. We are going to really be devoting quite a bit of time on today's call to audience questions to dig into this really important topic. And so now, the bio. So Neri Zilber is a journalist based in Tel Aviv and an adjunct fellow of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He is a regular contributor to the Daily Beast, Foreign Policy, The Globe and Mail, and Politico magazine. He is the co-author of State with No Army, Army with No State, Evolution of the Palestinian Authority Security Forces, 1994 to 2018, and the contributing author on Israel's social protest demonstrations for the Occupy Handbook, a chronicle of the global Occupy movement. Welcome, Neri.
Thank you, Abby, for having me and for J Street extending this really kind invitation.
Well, we're really happy to have you here. So we are just going to get right into it today. In order to kind of ensure that everyone's on the same playing field in terms of our various backgrounds and knowledge on Israeli politics, the parties, the demographics, the voting trends, I just want to have us take a look at the political map and the results. Here we are, 89.2%, the latest updates of all of the projections thus far. So I'm actually just gonna, my first kind of question, just so that we're all on the same page in terms of our knowledge on what each of these parties' political mandate is and their overall characteristics are. Neri, I just want to turn to you and kind of ask you to give us a really brief overview of each of the relevant political parties that we're going to be talking about today.
Sure thing. I mean, just really quickly, as we see with the breakdown in the voting tallies from yesterday, there's a Likud party, Bibi Netanyahu's right-wing governing party, far away in the lead. That was expected, but it is a significant lead, and we'll get into what that may mean in just a bit. Yesh Atid, which is the largest party in the anti-Netanyahu camp, really a centrist, center-left party led by Yair Lapid, who is the opposition leader. Shas is the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox party, close allies of Bibi Netanyahu. Aryeh Deri is the chairman of Shas, longtime chairman of Shas. Kahol Lavan, otherwise known as Blue and White, which is Benny Gantz's centrist party. Benny Gantz is still the current defense minister, and they were essentially the remaining slate of what was, after the third round, the rival to the Likud in terms of a possible governing party. Yamina is the right-wing pro-settler / liberal party led by Naftali Bennett, also a former defense minister, and he's a key player, and we'll get into him also in a second. UTJ, United Torah Judaism, is the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party, also close allies of Bibi Netanyahu. Israel Beitenu is Avigdor Lieberman's party, historically and traditionally the Russian immigrant party. He's right of center, but also staunchly anti-Netanyahu now for going on 2 years. The Labor Party, the resuscitated Labor Party, led by Merav Michaeli, and they obviously historically were the original governing party of Israel, and now trying to at least come back into some kind of relevance, which they appear to do yesterday. New Hope, Tikva Hadasha, is a new party. It is led by Gideon Sar. They basically were formed 2 or 3 months ago as a breakaway party from the Likud. So Gideon Sar was formerly an interior minister and an education minister under Netanyahu, and due to various differences, mostly personal to be honest, he broke away and took various right-wing and former Likud members with him. The Joint List, otherwise known as the Joint Arab List, that is an amalgamation of 3 distinct Arab factions. You have the communist faction, you have a kind of Palestinian nationalist faction, and then a pan-Arab nationalist faction as well. They actually decreased in strength, and we'll get into that as well. Religious Zionism, it's also an amalgamation of 3 distinct parties, really of the far right. They tout not only pro-settler agenda, but really a racist, almost fascist, and anti-LGBTQ agenda. Meretz is traditionally the left-wing party in Israeli politics. They're led by Nitzan Horowitz, and they also managed to get in, which wasn't a given, to get into the Knesset, and so they're sitting at 5 seats. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, a UAL, which is the United Arab List, more commonly known as RAM, per their Hebrew initials. They're the Islamist Arab List, led by an individual by the name of Mansour Abbas, a dentist from northern Israel, and he actually broke away from the Joint Arab List this time around, and did quite well, and has a lot of influence and power, which we'll also get into.
That's great. Thank you so much, Neri. That was really helpful. So now just moving back to the most recent results. It's a day after the election. Could you just offer us kind of a general overview of where things stand one day later? What are some of the possible projections, and when might we have a clear picture of a definitive majority?
Right. So this is the question everybody wants to know. Definitely people overseas looking at this from afar, and also people here in Israel. Not only just the average Israeli, but even the professionals who do this for a living, whether in the media or politics. It's quite a fluid situation. The long and the short of it is that we're more than likely looking at another stalemate and deadlock. So you showed the vote tally, and it's an official vote tally, we should note. There are about 89% of votes tallied. It's looking like, if we split it up into anti and pro Netanyahu blocks, which is really the defining dividing line in Israeli politics today, as it has been really over the past 2 years through 3 election rounds now, and now after a 4th. Bibi did not get his parliamentary majority. So in the Knesset, you have 120 seats, and for just a basic majority, you need 61. It doesn't seem like he got there. He's close. He and his allies, whether the ultra-Orthodox parties or the far right and pro-settler parties, are at 59 seats compared to a potential anti-Netanyahu bloc of 61 seats. And to make things easier, I'm including various potential wildcards in those 2 blocks, but I think that's that's a fair assumption as far as I'm concerned. So we're at 89% votes counted. We have about 500,000 votes left, including what they call here double envelope or absentee ballots. The Central Election Committee actually did a great job today of counting faster than we expected. So we have perhaps a more firm picture of where we stand, but they only expect the final vote tally to arrive Friday morning, before the Sabbath and before Passover, more importantly. And we're not expecting a huge change. It's unlikely that Bibi and his allies can get to 61, but it might shift very slightly, and we might actually have a divided parliament, 60-60, which isn't a small difference. It could have knock-on implications, but at the moment we're looking at 51-59 against Bibi. The broader narrative is that while Netanyahu didn't win, or perhaps didn't win at least right now, he didn't lose. He didn't lose because it'll be very unlikely for this anti-Netanyahu camp or this anti-Netanyahu bloc to actually get together and form a governing coalition here in Israel. He might be counting on that, and that, to be fair, that's somewhat surprising to all of us here that were following this campaign over the last 2 or 3 months, and really in the past week. It did seem like Netanyahu was surging in the final days of the campaign. He played up, and rightfully so, the fact that Israel is, as I'm sure everyone has heard, the world leader in vaccinations. A very fast vaccination campaign that started in December. And so through that, he managed to reopen the economy right on time for election day about 2.5 weeks ago. So now if you walk around Israel, and I'm here in Tel Aviv, things are open. People are out. Life is somewhat back to normal. And the thinking was that because of the economic reopening and the vaccination campaign, coupled with what Netanyahu emphasized as well, was the peace deals last fall, brokered by the Trump administration with various Arab states, would be enough to kind of carry him through and get him over the hump. But it didn't seem like he managed to quite get there. And that was in and of itself somewhat surprising. And I think the anti-Netanyahu forces, the opposition here, they won't admit it publicly, but given how the campaign developed, and given the risks to the various smaller parties that we identified previously not making it into the Knesset, a draw at the very least wasn't the worst option for the anti-Netanyahu forces. Obviously everybody would have much rather for them to win if you're on that side of the political divide. But this is where we stand at the moment. Just in terms of what's coming ahead, like I said, the final vote tally is expected Friday. Next Wednesday, the official count is supposed to go to President Reuven Rivlin, which according to Israel's political process, then has to start consultations with the various faction heads, and they come up to the president's residence in Jerusalem and tell them who they want to recommend for prime minister or not. And then the president has a week to task one of the faction heads with the first shot, so to speak, at forming a government. And that can take about 6 weeks in and of itself. So early days yet. This could take weeks and even 2 months or more until we have a government or not, and maybe a fifth election if things don't work out.
Right. Yeah. It seems like we've just seen this all play out fairly recently.
Welcome to my life.
Exactly. So I guess in that same vein, if Netanyahu does not gain the majority, what are some possible scenarios that are likely to play out?
Right. So this is really the question that people are asking. Okay, if the numbers hold, 61-59, even 60-60 to a certain extent, what now? I expect, it's not a given, I expect Netanyahu to get the first shot at trying to form a government. The Likud is far and away the largest party. He may likely have the most recommenders for the position of prime minister. So he might have the first shot, but it doesn't guarantee him a governing coalition. And this was the story of the past 2 years and the previous 3 rounds, where Netanyahu and Likud might have done quite well themselves, but the anti-Netanyahu forces, at the very least, played them to a draw and either forced another election, or, as was the case last year, Benny Gantz and at least part of the Blue and White Party agreed to form a national unity government with Netanyahu amidst the beginning of the coronavirus crisis, and that government lasted 7 months before Netanyahu blew it up himself. So this is, if anybody's asking why we're here right now after another round and a 4th election in 2 years, that is the specific reason. But look, the likeliest scenario is a 5th election. There are so many competing and contradicting promises and ideological differences and political differences, especially inside the anti-Netanyahu camp, that to form a governing coalition will be difficult. So people are already placing money on a 5th election, but barring that, there are a few scenarios that we can sketch out, at least theoretically, that might actually lead to a real government here in Israel and the avoidance of the 5th election. So I guess scenario number 2 still would be a narrow Netanyahu government. So while he doesn't have 61 at the moment, as Netanyahu does, he's going to try to lure 1 or 2 members of Knesset away from the anti-Netanyahu bloc and to join his what will be a narrow right-wing government. And the most likely candidates are from Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party, since they're still sitting in government with him, or Gideon Sa'ar, the defector from the Likud, and various members of his faction who, there's no real ideological difference between them and the Likud. Some of them were Likud members, senior Likud members, as of 3 months ago. But it should be noted that both Blue and White and New Hope have said over the past 24 hours or so that there's no chance of that happening, and that they won't sit in government with Bibi, and that will not happen. That remains to be tested. Netanyahu last night, in his pseudo victory speech, late last night in Jerusalem, started the process of trying to lure especially right-wing parliamentarians back into the fold. He emphasized all the things they have in common, and the agreements and the lack of ideological differences between him and them. But it's again, it remains to be tested. But we should at least take them at their word, because they've had the experience, at least, either from inside Netanyahu's government or from outside Netanyahu's government, of what happened last year, which was that Gantz took the gamble and broke his core election promise to his voters and entered into government with Netanyahu, and that didn't quite work out for him. That government only lasted 7 months, despite the agreement they had reached, and so it's a question in many people's minds of what's Netanyahu's promises actually worth anymore. So that's Netanyahu's, I think, core difficulty, is that we've seen this movie before, and that appeals to unity and appeals to the greater good here in Israel and appeals to avoiding a 5th election were fine a year ago before this round. So that's, if people are betting, that's maybe a less likely outcome than a 5th election, but more likely than what I'm about to propose at the moment in terms of other scenarios. The third scenario would be, okay, Netanyahu has 59. By the way, with Naftali Bennett, which isn't a given, but I'm including it anyway for both simplicity's sake and just based on Bennett's track record in the past, in terms of usually agreeing and entering into Netanyahu's government, if Netanyahu wants that, actually. So they need a few more seats. Where will that come from? So the kingmaker and the man of the hour in Israeli politics is actually Dr. Mansour Abbas, the dentist from northern Israel, the head of the Islamist Ram faction. He broke away from the joint list. There were a few reasons for it, But the main reason is that strategically, he didn't agree with the approach that the joint Arab list, the more traditional Arab political parties, always went and identified with the left, the far left, and were not part of the governing system here in Israel. They didn't have influence on decisions taken that affected Arab-Israeli lives. And we're talking primarily about the high rate of crime in the Arab-Israeli sector, the issue of the lack of housing, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of government budget and financing. And so it might surprise some people, but it's not, it wasn't a nationalist disagreement in terms of communists versus, pan-Arabists or Palestinian nationalists. It wasn't on the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it wasn't really an issue of, what the priorities were for the Arab-Israeli public themselves. It just was a question of how best to achieve those goals. And so Ram, led by Dr. Mansour Abbas, said, I'm not disqualifying anybody. I'm willing to work with anybody, including Bibi Netanyahu, to get what I want. And so his line now is that I'm not in anybody's pocket, and I'm not in the opposition, I'm not in the coalition, and I'm ready to do business. Now it's an open question whether he agrees to the scenario I'm about to sketch out, but it's at least in play, which is that he abstains from voting against the formation of a Netanyahu-led right-wing government. And through his abstention, Netanyahu and his allies are able to seat a government. So that's the third scenario that is being talked about. And there's a very interesting, and it became very public this morning, disagreement, both within the Likud party and amongst Netanyahu's right-wing allies about whether they can even accept the support, the tacit support of such an Islamist Arab party. It'll be fascinating to see, but at the very least, it's in play in terms of possibility. The fourth option is that Naftali Bennett, who also hasn't guaranteed his support to Netanyahu, defects. He defects from the anti-Netanyahu or from the pro-Netanyahu camp to the other camp. That won't be quite enough to get a majority in parliament to seat a government, but they might need the abstention of both Mansour Abbas's party and the other Arab parties. That would require as well a decision by Naftali Bennett and other right-wing parties in Israel to, again, agree that the same problem that Netanyahu and his allies have. Again, these scenarios, both Netanyahu and let's say the Bennett perhaps led anti-Netanyahu bid would be minority governments. So they wouldn't naturally have a majority in parliament, 61 seats, but you can actually form a government that way. It's never been done in Israeli history after an election, seating a minority government. It's definitely never been done with the support, whether active or passive, by the Arab Israeli parties. So again, in terms of percentages chance, it's unlikely, but at the very least, it's theoretically possible. There are other options in terms of, if we were talking about Netanyahu trying to find defectors from the other side, there is a possibility that the anti-Netanyahu camp will find defectors from within the Likud. The Likud has overall, through 3 election campaigns where their candidate for prime minister was unable to get a majority, they've overall remained loyal. It wasn't a given, especially in late 2019. Netanyahu actually did quite poorly after the second round, and so all of us were asking the Likud ministers and officials, isn't it time to maybe find a different approach to avoid a third election? And the response I got and others got was that it's not in the DNA of the Likud to topple our leader. That they don't do that, and they remained loyal. Gideon Sar defected, but that was after elections were already called, so it's a bit different this time around. Maybe the calculations from within the Likud might be a bit different, especially once they have this new Likud faction in the anti-Netanyahu camp. Again, a long shot, but it was interesting that there were certain members of the Likud, quite well-known members of the Likud, who didn't show up last night to Netanyahu's fake victory speech. And so people were speculating whether that was actually a sign of their displeasure at being sidelined by Netanyahu, not being given the support and the recognition that they felt they deserved. But again, the numbers would have to work out, and this would perhaps also be a minority government. And again, they'd have to agree to at least sit with left-wing factions like Labor, like Meretz, and then the obvious question is who actually leads this government. So it's less an issue perhaps of actual policies. It might be an ideological issue, but maybe even, and perhaps most importantly, an issue of egos. So those are, in terms of scenarios, what may happen. Last few hours, other scenarios, kind of outside the box thinking, has come into play. Defections from Netanyahu's actual camp. The ultra-Orthodox parties realize that Netanyahu can't get them the majority already for 2 years, so they decide to cut a deal with Gideon Sa'ar or Naftali Bennett or other right-wing leaders, and hopefully get through them what they may not get from Netanyahu, just given the political stalemate and the crisis here. I think that's also a long shot. The interesting scenario, to my mind, if the numbers hold and the anti-Netanyahu camp has 51 seats, there is the idea of appointing a new Speaker of Knesset, which would take control of parliamentary procedure, and then through that, passing a law banning Netanyahu from receiving the mandate and the ability to form a government in future, given his ongoing corruption trial and legal troubles. And through that, even if there's a fifth election, to essentially ban Netanyahu from the option of becoming prime minister, and through that, loosen up his grip on Likud. That may be put into motion, given the lack of other realistic options in terms of actually forming a government. I think it would have real knock-on effects in terms of just the basic stability here in the country. It's going to be a legal question whether that bill, if passed, can stand up to scrutiny by the Attorney General and the Supreme Court. We have to remember Netanyahu a year ago ran and got the mandate and formed a government as prime minister. He is still currently prime minister and will remain prime minister even if another election is triggered. But that hasn't deterred the opposition from seriously considering this option. So we have to keep an eye on that. So all in all, I wish I had better news, but this is what we're dealing with at the moment.
Thank you for laying out those possible scenarios. A quick shout out to our audience. We're getting some really great questions, and I encourage people to keep asking away. We'll get to those questions soon enough. And we're getting some requests from the audience to pull up that chart, which I think will be relevant for the next question I'm going to ask. So you've now laid out the scenarios. Considering some of the recent discussions around, what you just mentioned about the possible kingmaker. First it was maybe Bennett, maybe it still is. Now it's Mansour Abbas, or discussions around the total disappearance of Meretz as part of the center-left bloc, for instance. Could you speak to us a little bit about who the actual winners and losers are after yesterday's election?
Right. So we should hedge all of what I'm about to say because we don't have the actual results yet, and while I don't deem it likely that Netanyahu will end up with a slight parliamentary majority, we can say that certain parties and really personalities here did quite well. So we mentioned Merav Michaeli and Meretz, the left, the Israeli left, much disputed and much maligned, especially in recent years, but they really made a comeback. Especially Labor really came back from the dead. They were polling at 0 seats a few months ago before Merav Michaeli former journalist and strong feminist voice in Israeli society and politics, took the chairmanship of the party, won the chairmanship of the party, and really brought it back from the dead. And so they ended up with 7 seats, which was quite a solid showing. And so that, I think, is all for the good in terms of labor. And Meretz too, there were calls for Meretz to actually drop out of the race, given that it wasn't clear that they were going to make it in. And the fear was that they were going to waste tens of thousands of left-wing votes. But they managed to get in. And that's also, I think, all for the good if you're on that side of the political spectrum. It is interesting that Labor and Meretz's wins, they have different reasons for it, and you should draw different conclusions from it. So in terms of Merav Michaeli and Labor, it was really a resuscitation and a rebranding of this failing party, and it brought it back from the dead and really into the modern world, and it appealed to a lot of young people, especially women, and Merav Michaeli emphasizes issues like social equality, gender equality, and really it had an impact, and you could feel it, especially on the streets of Tel Aviv. Meretz, on the other hand, it was really almost a kind of a Save Meretz campaign, that you talk to Meretz voters and longstanding Meretz voters, and none of them are really excited about voting for Meretz, but at the end they pulled the trigger and cast the ballot for them to save Meretz. And the idea was that Meretz is asking me to save them. Why isn't Meretz saving me? And so it was almost kind of this strategic vote to save Meretz and thereby save any option of an anti-Netanyahu coalition rising. So that's in terms of the Israeli left. Benny Gantz, also much maligned by many, given his decision last year to enter into a government with Netanyahu. He also came back from the dead, and he had quite a solid showing. And he appealed more to kind of centrist mainstream Israel. And I think people were very happy with, perhaps his handling of issues like protecting the justice system, the legal system here from Netanyahu, from inside the government. He's still currently the defense minister. Others perhaps were also worried that he was not going to make it in, and so it was, again, a strategic vote like those cast for Meretz, but there's no denying that he did better than expected. Third winner, I would say, is Yair Lapid, and this might be a bit counterintuitive, but he accomplished all his goals. Again, if the numbers hold, we should remind people that. Yair Lapid, head of the opposition, he ended up as the largest party by far in the anti-Netanyahu camp. He ran a very unorthodox, shall we say, almost Joe Biden-esque campaign, where he almost didn't give interviews. It was quite minimalist and conservative campaign that he ran, but there was a logic to it. He didn't want to attack the parties to his left, because without him, the anti-Netanyahu bloc would have lost seats, and with that, the option of replacing Netanyahu. So he had to be careful in terms of his left flank, and he also had to be careful in terms of his right flank to not undermine the cases of Netanyahu rivals like Gideon Sa'ar and Naftali Bennett from the right, with the bogeyman, the specter of a Lapid-led left-wing government. And so he ran quite a intelligent yet risky campaign that seemed to pay off. So I think he also is a clear winner in terms of what his goals were going into this. Mansour Abbas, we touched on. It was a gamble for him to leave this joint Arab list, this amalgamation of all the Arab parties. And throughout, he said, we're going to make it in. We have the votes. Even last night, on election night, the pollsters said he wasn't going to make it in, but he and others in his camp told us that they had the votes. Somehow they counted the votes ahead of the vote counters, which is interesting. But he did, and it was a gamble that paid off. And now, as we talked about, he really is the kingmaker and in a position to influence events. And then finally, I think Naftali Bennett and Gideon Sa'ar, I think they're both the winners and losers of this campaign. They went into this current round touting themselves as prime ministers in future. and they both polled at different points at 20 seats and above. And they, at the very end, crashed down to the numbers you see below. But Sar, again, if the numbers hold, I think he may have done enough to take away right-wing and Likud voters from Netanyahu, which was really crucial in terms of denying Netanyahu a parliamentary majority. And then Bennett, same story for him, but he also now has options in terms of what he wants to do. I don't believe he's the kingmaker like people want to make him out to be. I think his options are more limited than he and certain analysts let on. But he does have options. And in one of the scenarios I sketched out where he defects, for his defection in terms of the anti-Netanyahu camp, he could demand, in theory, the prime ministership. So both winners and losers, but again, situation is fluid, and we have to wait till Friday for the final count, and then take it from there.
Thank you. I'd like to just switch gears a little bit before we get into our audience questions. So one of the questions that I've been thinking about is why is the Palestinian question absent from this election? It's really not being discussed at all. There's scheduled Palestinian elections in May, the first since 2005, and this is a really pertinent moment. And this is simply not part of the Israeli political discourse at the moment. Can you shed some light on why that might be the case?
Yeah, so it might come as a shock to people on the outside that it hardly played a role at all in this campaign. There was no real discussion about, say, the fate of the West Bank or the settlements. Those differences, if they exist between different parties, were played down for the greater good, shall we say, of replacing Netanyahu. And so you may have, in theory, like I sketched out, a future government stretching from Meretz on the left to the pro-settler Yamina Naftali Bennett on the right. And so in terms of actual policy, let's say in the West Bank, that remains to be seen how a government like that would actually function on that policy issue. But in terms of why it didn't play any role really, I mean, look, there are a few answers. Number one, like everywhere else over the past year, people here have been preoccupied with the coronavirus and the economic recession. So really, it was bread and butter issues and not bigger issues of foreign policy or war and peace, or even things like the future of the West Bank and the settlements. So that's really the immediate answer in terms of what was at play. And then in terms of the overall priorities of the Israeli public, it's not unique to this current election round or the last year, or even perhaps the last few years. When things are stable and quiet on the Palestinian front, when there aren't rockets being fired from Gaza or unrest and violence in and stemming from the West Bank, then the Palestinian question is both literally and figuratively over the hills and far away. And so it's very easy for the Israeli public, again, it's a wide generalization. There are elements of the Israeli left who care deeply about this issue, and I would say rightfully so. There are also elements of the Israeli right who care deeply about this issue for the opposite reason. But really, when everything is quiet and stable and it's out of sight and out of mind, then there's no immediacy to actually address this real kind of existential question, Palestinian question. And so that's been true now for many years, and I say that with great sadness. But that's, I think, the reality, both kind of almost socially and politically here in Israel.
Thank you. So another sort of more complex, maybe unsurprising and disturbing phenomenon that I would like to ask you about. There is legitimate concern that the political will of Meir Kahana's Kach party from the late 1980s has been resurrected through the Otzma Yehudit party. What does the rise and scope of right-wing political extremism indicate for the trajectory of Israeli politics?
So just by way of background for the viewers, Kahana and his movement, he was in the late 80s actually member of Knesset that was outlawed for his anti-Arab racism. Really, he and his descendants now, the Jewish Power faction, Osma Yehudit, it's Jewish fascist. We shouldn't beat around the bush. Now, Bibi Netanyahu decided that in his bid to get one or two last seats in this parliamentary majority that he's been seeking for 2 years, he arranged this merger of the religious Zionist party. So again, it's an amalgamation, and Jewish Power is one of those factions. And their representative, their MK, actually got into Knesset. And just based on the numbers, he will be in any future Netanyahu coalition. And so it's a real question. It's a real shame that the Israeli Prime Minister himself put the Jewish Power representatives in the Knesset and likely in his coalition if that were to come about. By the way, we should mention that it's not just the Jewish Power faction. There's also another smaller faction called the Noam faction that is part of religious Zionism, the larger party. Their entire agenda is anti-LGBTQ rights. Their spiritual leader is this rabbi in Jerusalem. Again, it's Judaism that harkens back thousands of years ago. And so these far right elements now have been made kosher, so to speak, by the Israeli Prime Minister himself, and may be actually part of his governing coalition. I think everyone needs to stop and think long and hard about whether the ends justify the means. And we should remember, just by way of background and context, previous Likud prime ministers in the 1980s shunned Kahana and actively worked to disqualify him from politics on the very legitimate grounds that he was a racist and a fascist.
Thank you. Well, things have certainly changed. So I'm actually going to start pulling some questions from the audience Q&A right now. So I'm seeing a couple of questions around the theme of Bibi's trial. So could you maybe just refresh our memories a bit on sort of where do things stand with Bibi's trial, and how might that affect plans going forward in terms of coalition building and how things might look for Bibi in the coming months?
Well, just in the immediate and very practical terms, in 2 weeks, his trial resumes, and it's the start of the evidentiary phase of his corruption trial, which means that 3 times a week in Jerusalem District Court, you're going to have witnesses, some of whom were very close former aides of Netanyahu, getting up on the stand and testifying against him. And that will obviously be reported and leaked. And so that in and of itself will complicate Netanyahu's life. But, you know, we talked about the Palestinian question. It was interesting too that Netanyahu's corruption trial was a factor in the campaign, but only as an abstract concept. In other words, Netanyahu has done a very good job in the last few years as the investigations and then the indictments and now the trial materialized and became public, did a very good job of pricing it in terms of whether people were for or against him. And so his supporters all believe that it's a conspiracy by the deep state to topple a right-wing prime minister, that the attorney general and the police investigators and the state prosecutors and in future likely the judges are all out to get him. Now, many of these individuals are not left-wingers by background, and many of them were appointed by Netanyahu himself. And so this conspiracy thinking shouldn't come as a surprise to those of you in America, but it was already in many respects priced in terms of Netanyahu's support and opposition to him. And so that's where it stands at the moment. You know, whether that will play into his calculations about his odds and his chances of a fifth election, it's hard to say. It may play into, and this goes back to various scenarios, you know, it seems far-fetched at the moment, But depending on how things go in coming weeks, it might be more realistic. Israeli President Reuven Rivlin, his term ends in June, which would be towards the end of the coalition building process, but definitely not after it. And so there is a possibility that Netanyahu may want to cut a deal and say, okay, look, I'm going to relinquish the prime ministership, but I want to be voted in and become president. And the president actually has immunity from prosecution for his term. And so that might be a roundabout way for Netanyahu to extricate himself, at least temporarily, from his legal troubles. I think it's far-fetched. I don't think Netanyahu himself is there yet, but it's at least being talked about because somebody will have to replace President Rivlin. And this goes back as well to 61 versus 59, 60 versus 60. If the Netanyahu camp takes control of the Knesset, then they ostensibly have the votes to elect their new president.
Great, thank you. I'm also seeing some questions here in the chat about the voter turnout in general. Can you speak to the voter turnout? Was it higher or lower than in the previous 3 elections? And what was the percentage of the votes from the Palestinian Citizens of Israel sector?
Right, so this was a concern going into election day yesterday. The actual voter turnout was fairly solid. It was about 4 or 5 percentage points lower than last year, than the third round. But that's not an overwhelming drop, given the fact that Israelis have gone to the polls now for 2 straight years, it seems like. The Israeli version of Saturday Night Live had a great line yesterday. We've turned from becoming the chosen people to the people who choose. We keep choosing politicians and parties again and again and again. And so apathy was a concern, but that didn't quite seem to materialize. Only a few percentage point drops, as I mentioned. And this, even with actually a significant drop in Arab Israeli turnout. So last year, it was about 65% in the Arab Israeli cities and towns. Now it was just over 50%. And so you've seen the Arab political parties actually lose a number of seats. But I think they did just enough, especially Mansour Abbas and the Ram faction to get in and to deny Netanyahu a majority, but by the skin of their teeth. And you can understand the frustration in the Arab Israeli demographic in terms of their own political representatives and like I said, the systemic problems that plague them in terms of lack of funding and infrastructure and housing and just the booming relative to Israel rate of crime and violent crime. And so, they did just enough, but turnout was definitely lower.
Thank you. So this next question relates to kind of the prominent feature of this notion of pro-Bibi or anti-Bibi that's just, ubiquitous throughout this election cycle. And so, sorry, I'm just looking for that question. Would you say that the impact from the Balfour protests that launched last summer have had an impact on the current election, and how so?
So, this protest movement against Netanyahu that started last summer and kind of weekly demonstrations in Jerusalem and other places around the country, it did have an impact, but mostly on opposition politics, how various parties and politicians framed their public messaging and who embraced the protests and who didn't. But in terms of kind of sweeping and galvanizing the public, that didn't quite happen. They did manage to hold some very large demonstrations, and that was a strong sign of force. But again, the bottom line to what we've been seeing yesterday and now for 2 years is that Israel is a highly divided country along the lines of really one person, whether you're pro-Bibi or anti-Bibi. And so the demonstrators were the kind of spear the tip of the spear in terms of the anti-Bibi public, and I think that did have a galvanizing effect, but again, only on that side of the divide.
I'm going to just turn also back to Palestinian society inside of Israel. Given last summer was a very impactful summer. Given last summer's normalization agreements, with Bibi's embrace of Arab culture and society since the signing of those accords, how has that been received by voters in Arab and Jewish society inside of Israel? Is it something that is palpable in voting, in the voting results?
I think it was. So we talked about Arab turnout. It was interesting that this time around, Netanyahu embraced the Arab-Israeli public, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, 20% of the citizenry here, and this was a stark contrast to what had been his messaging now since really the beginning of his political career, which is that the Arab-Israeli public and working politically with the Arab-Israeli public was taboo. He called left-wing politicians who countenanced doing so traitors. As recently as last year, he called the Arab-Israeli members of Knesset terrorist supporters. And so the tune has changed, and there was a reason for that. He understood that Arab-Israeli turnout actually denied him a majority a couple times. And so his move was to try to poach voters from within the Arab-Israeli demographic. And at the very least, if he wasn't able to do that, to depress the vote amongst that demographic. And also through Mansour Abbas, he actually managed to split the Arab-Israeli political parties. So his strategy actually was quite successful. Votes for Likud actually increased in many Arab-Israeli towns and cities, but it wasn't quite enough to put him over the edge. And this ties back to the issue of the peace treaties last year. So we heard it last night in his fake victory speech. I'm the prime minister who brought everybody vaccines. I'm the prime minister who brought everybody peace deals. Again, it's a very different Netanyahu. It's, to me, rank hypocrisy, especially given his messaging after round 2 and round 3 in recent years. And so now, if he needs Mansour Abbas, he needs Ram to give him a government, he may be willing to do business with him. The only upside of that is that it will actually legitimize the utilization of Arab-Israeli political parties for the center and the left. That's something they were scared of doing in the past, definitely last year, when it was a possibility, and Benny Gantz and certain elements of his party refused to do that. If Netanyahu at least starts negotiations with Mansour Abbas, the only upside would be that perhaps other definitely right-wing politicians would now deem it okay. It's sad that it had to take Bibi Netanyahu to make it okay. But to be fair, also Yair Lapid has said now for a year or two that he would be willing to do that if he were given the shot.
Thank you. I'm gonna just pose 1 or 2 more questions from the audience. So this one is a bit more specific. Any way of knowing where the outstanding 11% of the vote is coming from?
Not in terms of who they voted for, but we do know that the absentee ballots here historically were soldiers, sailors, diplomats who voted not near home or overseas. So overwhelmingly they weren't going to go, let's say, to Arab parties. But this time around, because of COVID regulations, we've had double the absentee ballots. And so you have people that are in quarantine, people who are in hospital, old age homes, poll workers. They increased the number of poll workers dramatically this time around. and so people voted absentee if they were working the polls yesterday. The sense is that they'll break fairly evenly, that it won't be a huge swing towards one party or another. Yeah, that's, I think, in terms of the remaining vote count, 500,000 votes.
Thank you. So I actually think we're going to wrap it up for today. I think we covered some really extensive ground, and I really appreciate you laying out all of the possible scenarios. They number many, and I think it will be curious to see how they all pan out. I would like to just see if you could offer us just a couple of lasting words, if you just have any thoughts on just sort of how you see things unfolding in the next 2 weeks. If you just can offer us some sort of sense of what we can look toward, I would just love to hear some lasting words from you.
Right. So look, it's a fluid situation. We have the official benchmarks that I mentioned in terms of the final vote count on Friday. The president gets the results next week, and then the consultations begin. And we'll have to see who recommends who, and who at least has first shot at forming a government, and then they'll have 6 weeks. That's all a given. That's all expected. I think the real action will be in terms of the backroom negotiations and the public messaging. And I say that in terms of definitely, whether the pro or anti-Bibi bloc are willing to do business with Mansour Abbas and the other Arab Israeli parties. I think that will be a key issue. You also have to see where Naftali Bennett is heading, although, like I said at the top, I think his options are a bit more limited than other people imagine. So those two key figures. And then obviously once the official vote is certified and a Knesset is actually seated, and that happens before a prime minister or a new government is formed, so you have an actual functioning Knesset. If the opposition, if the anti-Netanyahu camp has a majority, what do they do with that majority? And this is a scenario I sketched out in terms of passing a law banning a prime minister under now trial for corruption for forming a government. So I think those are key issues. And then you're going to see a lot of headlines. Some so-and-so said this, so-and-so met with this person. Take it with a grain of salt. There's going to be a lot of public signaling and leverage plays, as I like to call it. So an example of this would be whether, if Mansour Abbas went to meet with Netanyahu publicly, then who would Mansour Abbas go meet next? Would people actually run with that and say, okay, now this is, Bibi has made this kosher, and so now our thinking in terms of what's possible, in terms of seating a government, whether a proper government or a minority government, has changed. And I think all of that will be known in terms of the public messaging and these kind of very, very minute, in the weeds leverage plays. And I think that's something to keep an eye on as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Neri. It was really a pleasure to hear from you. I feel like there's just so many layers of information to think through, on the edge of our seats. At least I know I am. While these election results continue to unfold. Really, on behalf of J Street, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us and analyze and contemplate with us. Really important, really compelling and interesting. And thank you to our audience for all of the questions. I would, of course, like to make a plug for our first ever virtual conference, which is taking place on April 18th and 19th. So if you have not done so already, I encourage you to register for the conference. We're going to be digging into conversations about Israeli politics. Hopefully we'll have some more tangible updates with regard to who's the minister and who's going to be the next government. And so we're going to be digging into all sorts of conversations such as this. And so we really encourage you to register. You can find the link there, jstreet.org/conference. And again, thank you so much for being here on behalf of J Street. And I hope you have a wonderful evening, morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much.